Welcome to Tracy Aaron Talks, where functional medicine meets personal development. You want to be living your best life, but the overwhelming amount of health information out there is confusing, and the way you think about yourself is keeping you stuck. You know you are meant for more. As a women's health specialist, my aim is to simplify and equip you with the tools you need to be beautifully balanced from the inside out. Welcome back to Tracy Aaron Talks, where today we are going to talk about understanding your female cycle and the hormones and symptoms that you might experience throughout the month. So today, let's unravel the mysteries of this female cycle. We will explore the key hormones involved and discuss the common symptoms that you might experience during each phase, especially if you are dealing with hormonal imbalances. So let's start with number one, understanding the menstrual cycle and what happens. Then we will go into the hormonal changes and the impact they have in our bodies, particularly as we move through the 4 phases of our cycle. And then we will finish up with some lifestyle tips to manage some symptoms, as well as how we can use functional medicine to take a deeper dive to figure out what is going on behind the scenes so that we can address things with some kind of precision. It's very important to know exactly what's going on. And thankfully, with functional medicine testing, we can get very, very close to that. So let's go ahead and dive in and talk about the menstrual cycle. So we've got 4 phases. We start with the menstrual phase, then the follicular phase, the ovulation phase, and then the luteal phase. And your hormones are fluctuating through each of these phases. The hormones that we will be focused on today, we will be talking about estrogen, progesterone, follicle-stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. Let's start with that menstrual phase. Menstrual phase is day one of your cycle where you begin the bleeding process. Now, in terms of hormones, this is where you have the lowest level of estrogen and progesterone. If there has not been a fertilized egg that has implanted into that thick uterine lining, it begins by the signaling of low estrogen and progesterone to slough off that uterine lining. No pregnancy has been achieved that month. Therefore, it starts over the process all completely again. So, low levels of estrogen and progesterone, the menstrual phase is that sloughing off of the uterine lining where whatever has been built up by good nutrition and juicy hormones all month long is now being released from the body so that it can start that process all over again. Now, as you're well aware, some common symptoms that you might experience during your menstrual phase can be things like cramping or lower back pain or fatigue, right? And some of these symptoms can be exacerbated by an imbalance in estrogen dominance or low progesterone. And as we've talked about before, I always want to draw attention to the word balance when we are talking about hormones. We can really only talk about hormones in any kind of way to give them justification if we are talking about them in terms of what their ratio is one to another, what their balance is between the other. So it's never very helpful to isolate a hormone, in particular estrogen and progesterone, and make the decision whether or not we have enough of it. We have to look at estrogen and progesterone in relation one to another. So that is very important when we're talking about troubleshooting some of our common hormone problems. It's all about the balance. So if they're both high, that's one thing. If they're both low, that's one thing. If one is high and the other one is low, that's another thing, right? But we can't isolate those two. We must look at them in relation one to another. So that's something that we really need to make sure that we keep in focus in terms of testing. So then after the menstrual phase, that usually lasts anywhere from 3 to 7 days for the typical female. Anything longer than 7 days, and if it's happening regularly, it does create some cause for a potential menstrual cycle issue in terms of hormone balance. So you want to be aware of that. Anything between 3 and 7 days is perfectly normal. After the menstrual phase, generally around day 5, day 7, we move into the follicular phase. This is where we have rising estrogen levels, and this is the peak of follicle stimulating hormone. This is that hormone that peaks in our bloodstream, and we can measure it. In fact, this is the only hormone that I would recommend ever using a blood test to look at. Follicle stimulating hormone. You can test this usually between days 3 and 7. There is an increase in this FSH hormone. And as the name indicates, it is that chemical messenger inside of our bloodstream that is signaling our ovaries to create a follicle. Now, that follicle is that beginning of the female side of what needs to be fertilized, implanted in order to achieve a pregnancy. So the follicle stimulating hormone raises quite rapidly during that follicular phase as that follicle is being developed inside of the ovary. Also, we are having the rising of estrogen levels during this time. So, you might experience things like increased energy, a better mood. But for some people, they also might experience anxiety or migraines as estrogen peaks. I always recommend cycle tracking. I will attach in the show notes one of my very favorite resources for tracking your period because it's very helpful to know if you're getting if you're getting headaches throughout your cycle, it's good to know, are they happening when estrogen is generally dominant? Is it happening when progesterone should be at its peak? Or when during the cycle are you getting these symptoms? And even without a test, we can tell a whole lot based on how the body is communicating with you. So if you're getting headaches during that follicular phase with rising estrogen levels, it tells us a lot about what's going on inside of your body in terms of how your body is producing, utilizing, and disposing of estrogen within the body. So, that follicular phase is what happens next, and that phase lasts until ovulation. So, the third phase of the the female menstrual cycle is the ovulation phase. So, in terms of hormones, this is where we have a surge in what's called luteinizing hormone, or for short, LH. We also have high estrogen and the onset of progesterone begins. So, luteinizing hormone is made in the pituitary gland, which is that small gland at the base of your brain. And the hypothalamus is involved here because the hypothalamus is telling your pituitary gland how much luteinizing hormone to make. Now, interestingly, luteinizing hormone is very critical in both men and women. For men, luteinizing hormone causes the testicles to make the hormone testosterone, which is important for making sperm. And normally, luteinizing hormone does not change that much for men throughout their. They don't really have female cycles quite like we do. So you can test that on different days of the month and get a fairly consistent reading. However, in girls, when girls are just entering their puberty, era, like it can start as early as age 8, typically it's sometime between 10 and 12, luteinizing hormone begins to rise along with levels of other hormones. And this begins the physical changes of puberty, like the growth of breasts, body hair, and the beginning of menstruation. And likewise for men, you also get those voice changes, the growth of facial body hair. This is the beginning of that testosterone driven puberty cycle, and also sperm production is in the middle of all of that. So, luteinizing hormone is at its peak during this phase. And what that hormone is doing is it is triggering the onset of ovulation. It's triggering the ovaries to release that follicle so that it can float down the fallopian tubes, and it can, if there is a fertilization, it can be implanted and a new life can form from that. If not, you still release luteinizing hormone you need that ovary to release that egg for it to go through its normal cycle period. So during this phase, it's very interesting. You might have a very stark difference in your symptoms during the ovulation phase. With that surge of luteinizing hormones, with estrogen being at its peak and also progesterone getting started, your libido begins to increase. You have heightened senses, like touch is more important to you. You feel you feel like everything is more real, more sensual. You feel things deeper inside of your body. And all of this begins with this surge of these new hormones when they're at their peak. However, some women during this ovulation phase can experience what we call mid cycle spotting or pain during ovulation. And this, if you're tracking your cycles, can also help indicate some kind of hormonal imbalance. So, again, I always recommend writing things down and keeping track so that you can notice patterns. Lastly, after the woman has ovulated, she enters the luteal phase. Now, during the luteal phase, this can last anywhere from 12 to 14 days, and this is the dominance of progesterone. Estrogen has now begun to decline, and progesterone is dominating this entire phase. So, symptoms that might come along with that luteal phase, well, right after ovulation, women typically feel their best. They do still have high energy levels. They're feeling pretty good about things. At the closer a woman gets to her menstrual cycle, then she will begin to experience, if there's hormonal balance, those symptoms of what we call PMS, the premenstrual syndrome, things like bloating, mood swings, food cravings, and any kind of changes within the anxiety, fear cycle, or ruminating thoughts, and even depression. These are all signs of PMS and can indicate hormonal dysfunction or imbalance in the luteal phase. So, I want to talk a little bit about estrogen and progesterone, particularly. So, those are the two hormones that really dominate the phases that we go through. Again, menstrual, then follicular, then ovulation, and then luteal. This whole entire process takes place anywhere between, well, 28 days, as they say, but you can range up to 32 or 34-day cycles and still be quote unquote normal. Again, what we're looking for is ratios. We're looking for balance. So we want the menstrual phase to be a certain period of time, but not longer or shorter. We want the follicular phase to be a certain period of time, again, not shorter or longer. Ovulation happens generally within a 24-hour period. It can occur shorter, maybe 16 hours, can last up to 32 hours, but it generally is around a day. And then after that, that luteal phase, we really want it to be 10 to 14 days. It can be a little bit longer, but any variation from the balance or the ratio of these things can point to some kind of hormonal imbalance. So it's all about how each one is in relation to the other. So, real quickly, if you have something called an ovulatory cycle, this is that menstrual cycle in which ovulation did not occur. So, that's one of the common issues that can happen for a female. And if this is happening, then progesterone is not being made, progesterone is not peaking, and you are not releasing that egg. And it can be a dysfunction of the luteinizing hormone. It can be a dysfunction of follicle-stimulating hormone. This is where testing will come in so that we can figure out exactly what's going on. This female cycle is like a symphony or like an orchestra. All these various pieces play their part. And while there is variations of what we might refer to as normal, we want all of these players to have their moment of time. So anytime there's an issue, we need to then begin looking at, okay, which one was missing, which one was too loud, which one was too quiet, which one stayed too long, which one didn't play their part long enough, etc. So it's all a process, and it's like we need the big picture before we figure out really some more of the details. But an ovulatory cycle is definitely one of those common issues that women can experience. And so with that, there's no luteal phase. So you're having higher estrogen without the creation of progesterone in the body, and that can create all kinds of symptoms. But anyway, let me skip back to estrogen. Estrogen and progesterone are those two female sex hormones that we talk a lot about in terms of the female cycle. So, estrogen is the generic term. That's the first thing I want to say is that estrogen is just an umbrella. It's a term that can refer to any kind of estrogen, including the body's own estradiol. We make three different types of estrogen. So, but estrogen is also referred to or can incorporate those plant estrogens, those phytoestrogens in our body, mostly from our diets. And then it can also include the form that people consume in terms of the birth control pill. So estrogen is just that generic term. We can get more specific in terms of which kinds of estrogens we are talking about at any one period of time. But estradiol is the one that really steals the show. It's like the queen estrogen. That's the estrogen that your body makes on its way to ovulation. Now, it's not the only estrogen, like I mentioned, because we can make estrone from our adipose or fat tissue. We also make estrogen metabolites in the gut. But estradiol is the strongest and best estrogen. And so, together with progesterone, it does so many important jobs. Important jobs like building muscle and bone and maintaining the health of the brain and heart. So, this particular estrogen, this estradiol, is very important in a healthy metabolic rate. Women who have a hard time losing weight around the middle or the fat around the middle, this is a symptom of some kind of imbalance with this estradiol. So, together with progesterone, it helps women stay more sensitive to insulin. It also reduces the chance of diabetes. And this particular unique situation with the female hormone sex cycle is what keeps women lower on the scale of insulin sensitivity and diabetes than our counterparts as men. So, praise God for the female sex hormone cycle, right? It's not all bad. In fact, when it's functioning normally, it's actually quite a beautiful thing. So, that's my goal here is that we all would achieve this hormone balance. But I want you to be aware of what can happen along the way. So, it helps us with our insulin sensitivity. It helps us to become less likely to develop that diabetes. So, I like to call this the estrogen advantage. So, also estradiol helps increase the muscle strength, and it gives us that desire to move and exert the body. So when estrogen is high, when we have high estrogen levels during that follicular phase, that first week to 2 weeks before ovulation, that's when you can think about exercising with a higher demand on the body. HIIT training, cycle classes, CrossFit style, heavier weightlifting, sprints. These types of things are excellent during this follicular phase because we have this natural desire to move and exert the body. Interestingly, also, estradiol acts as a natural appetite suppressant. So that might be why you feel less hungry in the days leading up to ovulation. That's when that estradiol is high. Or also when you might feel more hungry in the final few days before your period, because that is when the estradiol begins to drop away. If there's no fertilization, that is when you slough off that uterine lining, you begin the process all over again, right? So I don't mean to overstate it, but estrogen truly is wonderful. I know it gets a bad rap. However, if it is in balance with the other hormones, namely progesterone within the body, estrogen gives us a tremendous amount to be thankful for. Now, there are downsides, right? When it's imbalanced, we can experience things like an extra stimulation of breast tissue or an over thickening of the uterine lining. If this is happening, we can tend to experience things like heavy periods, especially during those early perimenopausal years when you make a higher than normal amount of estrogen and your progesterone levels are beginning to taper off. But without those type of symptoms, estrogen really is a queen in our body and something that we can get a lot of benefits from. So let's talk about that sister hormone, progesterone. Progesterone comes on the scene after ovulation. And interestingly, you make a whole lot more progesterone than you do estrogen. Now, if you've ever looked at a blood test, which again, I don't recommend for looking at estrogen and progesterone, you'll see more, the number will be higher in estrogen than it will in progesterone. But I just want you to know not to be fooled because it's just the units that it's measured in. Our bodies actually make far more progesterone than we do estrogen. Now, progesterone also has many, many beneficial effects. So most notably is the thinning of that uterine lining, right? So if excess estrogen stimulates the production of a thicker uterine lining, then it would go to follow that progesterone is responsible for the thinning of that uterine lining, which counteracts estrogen's thickening. So that's really nice in terms of preventing those heavy periods. If you are experiencing really heavy periods, you can think in terms of blaming estrogen and not enough progesterone. Also, though, progesterone is amazing because it helps calm the brain. It can therefore reduce anxiety and it promotes sleep. Progesterone is that happy hormone. So if you're feeling cool, calm, collected the second 2 weeks of your cycle, especially leading up to your period, you can have a really good sense that your progesterone levels are where they should be. However, in contrast, if you're having difficulty sleeping, if you're having more anxiety throughout your day, or if you're having those ruminating thoughts where your brain just doesn't experience that same level of calmness, you can think to yourself, my progesterone levels might be too low. Now, progesterone also reduces things like inflammation in the body. It normalizes immune function. It builds up the bone. It protects the heart. It helps increase the metabolic rate. It also can help prevent breast cancer. So, interestingly, with the onset of perimenopause, that's what we call that second puberty. That's that phase right before your final period, which is the menopausal phase. You stop ovulating and you lose almost all the progesterone. Well, this is interesting because in the perimenopausal period, you're still making estrogen. And that's because of an enzyme in our body called aromatase, where we can create estrogens from our androgens like testosterone. So we can also make it from an androgen called DHEA, which I'll talk about another time too. So all of the whole hormonal cascade is fascinating because it's like a domino effect. One thing leads to another. And if there's any kind of cog in this wheel, we can have a lot of disruption downstream, which is what's happening when we're having these period issues here. So ovulation is the star of this entire cycle, and ovulation builds health. So let's think about it like this. Your cumulative lifetime exposure to both estrogen and progesterone is completely beneficial. Even years after you reach menopause and you make less estrogen and no progesterone. So what we're looking for here is the most important thing before a female goes into that menopausal period and you're no longer cycling is to do whatever you can to maintain an ovulatory menstrual cycle for as long as possible. And that is because when these hormones are balanced in our body, it has systemic effects. Things that we've already mentioned, like preventing osteoporosis, breast cancer, even heart disease. These are the common things that women face in menopause and after they're no longer cycling anymore, right? We've got an increase in breast cancer. Heart disease is on the rise. In fact, heart disease is more of an issue for women later in life than it is for men. And also osteoporosis, bone density, right? Which is why women need to continue weight-bearing exercises, particularly lifting heavier weights as long as possible, because that strain on our bones helps strengthen them and prevents osteoporosis. So this balance of estrogen and progesterone, we want to be in our bodies as long as possible. So, if we can help these cycles happen naturally and in balance, it helps us to build a healthier and more resilient physiology much, much, much later in life, even post menopause. So, I want you to think of a healthy ovulatory cycle through all of these four phases like a deposit into the bank account of your long term health. Hormone balancing is not just so that you'll have stable moods and feel better. Hormone balancing is so that you will have the type of longevity that you're longing for with lower incidences of cancer, of heart disease, of diabetes, of osteoporosis and other bone density issues well into your golden years. So, prioritizing hormone balance is one of the best things we can do for longevity. So, this is a good segue. Let's go ahead and move right into some lifestyle tips to keep these phases healthy and to manage some of these symptoms. One of the most important things we can do is control our nutrition. If we can emphasize blood sugar control in anti inflammatory foods, we have a much better chance of these phases moving seamlessly. Now, if we are eating lots of high carbohydrate foods, processed foods, sugary foods, uh, any kind of inflammatory foods, seed oils, trans fats, etc., hydrogenated fats, these types of foods have a effect on the stress hormone cortisol. And when cortisol is prioritized in the body, we are not making the sex hormones the way that we need to. It's almost a guarantee that you will have a sex hormone imbalance somewhere in one of these four phases, if not all of them, when we are not prioritizing our nutrition. And that's because cortisol causes blood glucose to spike. And if our blood glucose is spiking, then we're not having stable blood sugar. If we're not having stable blood sugar, the downstream effect is these sex hormones are low, low, low on the priority list, and our body just does not begin to make them. Also, if we're not managing our stress, so after nutrition, the best thing we can do is to utilize stress management techniques, things like meditation or journaling, prioritizing healthy sleep, focusing on anything that will reduce those cortisol spikes. When we can manage our cortisol and we have a proper diurnal and circadian rhythm throughout the day, we have a much better chance of managing our hormonal symptoms. Lastly, one of the most important things that we can do is exercise, move our bodies. Well, sunshine too. I should say getting morning sunlight is just key to maintaining healthy hormone balance. But after that, we need to move our bodies. So interestingly, you can tailor the phases of your cycle to the types of movement that you do throughout the day. In the same way that you can eat for hormone balance, you can also move for hormone balance. So you think about things that are gentle and restorative during the menstruation phase. Then you can include more vigorous activity during the follicular and the ovulatory phases. Then, as we're prioritizing, then when our body is prioritizing that progesterone level and we have that happy hormone stimulating us, we can do things like long walks, like things that are not too stressful on the body, but we can go for longer periods of time. We can do things like that during the follicular phase. So, not the follicular phase, the luteal phase, where we have higher progesterone in our body. Then again, we move into that menstrual phase next. We go into the restorative stretching, Pilates, yoga, etc. So through diet, through stress management, through the amount of sunshine we allow into our eyeballs and through our skin, and also through our daily choices with exercise and movement, there's a lot we can do to manage these symptoms and to keep these phases moving at their peak. So let's move right into how we can use functional medicine testing to assess all of this and the best way to go about that. Now, my favorite test that I love to use with my clients when I'm looking for hormone balance is something called the Dutch test. The Dutch test is a dried urine test that looks at the metabolites of these hormones. It gives us a very comprehensive multi-page report back where I can get a really good look at not only the sex hormones, I can get a good look at the stress hormones of cortisol. Do we have a proper diurnal rhythm throughout the day? Or if cortisol is imbalanced in this way, it can really explain why we have these energy surges and dips at times where we don't want them, right? We get our day started and we need our cortisol to be high because we got to get out of bed and we've got a lot of stuff to accomplish during the day. But if we have low cortisol, forget it. You're drinking your third cup of coffee and you want to go back to bed. However, what about that cortisol surge at night where you need to be sleeping, but you feel that second wind? You feel like you're a night owl. Well, I just call that high cortisol in the wrong time of day. So we want that rhythm to be rebalanced. We want your body to function like that metronome where it is constantly releasing the right amount of hormones at the right times of day. Now, you could be releasing the right amount of hormones at the wrong time of day and experience an entirely different life. So that's what I do with the women in my practice is I help them get this back on track. So it looks at those stress hormones. It also looks at insulin and the metabolic hormones. Thankfully, too, the Dutch gives us a really nice look at what the thyroid is doing because we can see how hormones are being metabolized, and the thyroid is the master metabolism gland. So it gives us a really good window into things like thyroid disorders and imbalances. The Dutch test also gives us a look inside the gut with a small but very effective organic acid profile where we can see how metabolites are working through various forms of the gut. If we're experiencing hormone imbalance as a result of the gut, if we're experiencing as a result of stress, if we're experiencing a result of the thyroid, these are all totally different approaches. And this test gives us the best chance at seeing all of them. I also like to utilize the GI map if there's specific gut symptoms, because, like I said, so many hormones are metabolized and produced inside of the gut, and everything happens inside of our gut has that downstream effect on the rest of our hormones. So sometimes the GI map, which is a stool test, is also really good to do. One of the best things about both of these tests is that you can do them at home. They're relatively affordable for the amount of information that you get back, and they can tell you just a really, really specific and efficient view at what's going on under the hood, so to speak. So, those are two that I love to use in my practice. There's so many more, but those are the two that I find that are the most telling in terms of where to start with hormone imbalance. Now, if clients are looking at a particular fertility issue, or they're really wanting to do a deeper dive into things like follicle-stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone, there are other ways to test those, particularly if we're looking to achieve a pregnancy. So, what I want you to know is that you have the power to reclaim your health. And it all starts with a really solid knowledge base of what's supposed to be happening so that you know what to expect. And when you know what to expect, you can have the awareness to know if what's going on inside of your body and what you're experiencing in terms of your moods and energy level, if that's quote unquote normal, or if it's outside of what we consider normal. And when you have that awareness and that knowledge of what should be happening, you can be proactive about managing this very intimate side of who you are as a female. So, when we understand these hormonal changes, we can begin to troubleshoot. Couple that with functional medicine testing, and we have what I would consider a perfect recipe for getting the best hormone balance that we can. Add in some lifestyle techniques there, and we are well on our way to feeling our best day after day. You do not need to suffer through your hormonal cycle. You don't need to suffer throughout the weeks and even the days. You can sail smoothly throughout the month when you have hormonal balance. So, if any of this type of testing sounds interesting to you, please get in touch with me. I would love to help you get well on your way with this. Again, like I mentioned, I'm going to tack on in the show notes a cycle tracking sheet for you to print out and utilize. And you can keep that by your bed or somewhere where you have a pen handy, and you can track your cycles throughout on a daily basis so that you can take a panned out view of what's going on and really get dialed in on what symptoms you're experiencing when, so that you can begin to troubleshoot. However, I'm always open. I would love to help you. So please reach out to me and let me see how I can help you dial this in so that you can experience better hormonal harmony through the beautifully balanced method that I used in the balanced hormone solution. I do this through group programs and also one-to-one. So let me know how I can help you. I hope this general overview of the 4 different cycles and what you might experience in each one of them was helpful. And there's so much more to talk about in terms of exact symptoms, and we will be doing more deep dives in the future with this. I hope this was beneficial to you, and I can't wait to see you in the next episode. Have a great day, my friends. Thank you for joining me today on Tracy Aaron Talks. I hope you found today's episode enriching to your life. If you enjoyed today's content, would you consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving a review? That simple act helps this podcast get into the hands and ears of many more women just like you. Remember, anything you want and do not yet have will require a new set of beliefs, thoughts, actions, and a new you. I am honored to be on this journey with you as we wholeheartedly pursue true health and wellness in mind, body, and soul.